thanks again, everyone who's joined thus far. My name is Terry Grossheim. I'm one of the co-organizers for ACM DC. I'm joined by Alvin and Mark from ACM Chicago and Lauren, who's our speaker this evening. And we'd like to thank you for attending. Tonight, we're going to be talking about data governance, a topic I personally am a fan of. Lauren has named her talk Designing Data Governance for Data Architecture. It's a joint meetup between ACM Chicago and ACM DC. If you didn't catch us chatting beforehand, if you have any questions during the presentation, please put it in the Q&A section. And we'll also be offering continuing education credits as well. I don't know, Mark and Alvin, if you want to chat about that now or if you want to hold off on that.
Yeah, we can hold on to that later after.
Okay, sounds good. So a special thanks again for everyone who helped organize with the event this evening. I already introduced Mark and Andrew. Mark and Alvin. Andrew Conklin is my counterpart for ACM DC. And then we also have folks joining from IEEE Computer Society Chicago as well. It was definitely a team effort, and feel free to reach out to us if anybody is interested in presenting in future meetups and or has any follow-up questions after the meetup this evening. And then we have a upcoming meetup on June 14th. Mark and Alvin, did you want to talk to this?
Yeah, maybe Mark, you can go ahead.
Sure. So Wanu Altanu was the moderator for our special guest a number of months ago, Matt Welsh, the end of programming. And so she was the moderator on the recent ACM Tech Talk. And I was really impressed with her. And I asked Matt, and he said, she's a great speaker. And I was really attracted to the idea that we'd have a venture capital speaker, which is the first, as far as I can recall, for our group. And I think this will be a really great event. And people will learn a lot about the venture capital process that hasn't maybe been as available to many of us, let's say lesser individuals. So that's our talk in 2 weeks. I think it's going to be really great. Hope you can be there.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren, who is joining us this evening, is coordinating a code with her publisher for meeting attendees to receive a free copy of her ebook, Designing Data Governance, 6 Steps to Build a Data-Driven Culture. So Lauren, make sure at the end of our presentation, you address the attendees with how you anticipate helping us out. Sound like a plan?
Will do.
Okay, great. So a little bio about Lauren is up on the screen here, but more about our presentation. Organizations own more data than ever before, but if it's of no value if you don't know how to use it. Most teams lack the strategy to clean, collect, organize, and automate data for production-ready projects. The good news is data governance, the people, processes, and strategy needed for deploying data projects to production, offers new opportunities to improve service delivery. This session shares how data leaders can embed data governance into data mesh cloud architecture. Attendees will learn how to unite cross-functional teams and data stewards to automate unified standards into data mesh, which emphasizes data domain ownership through self-service architecture. Whether you're a chief data officer or individual contributor, this talk will show you how to manage up, get the buy-in you need to build data governance, and find the right colleagues to co-create governance and build cloud architecture that better serves the public. Lauren is with Steampunk, and she's done some great things as what's been published here in her bio. So I'll go ahead without further ado and hand this off to Lauren.
Thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today about this topic. I was telling Terry and Alvin and Mark that I was a speaker for ACM DC 4 years ago. So if you're doing the math, that was pre-pandemic, and obviously a lot has changed. But I'm very excited to be with you tonight because I have recently published a book on this topic of designing data governance, and I think it's especially relevant now more than ever because we are now in this era of generative AI. When I put the book in beta last fall. This was right before ChatGPT came to market. And by last winter, it was dominating every conversation that I entered. I had a student in my interaction design class this past spring ask me unprompted if I thought that AI posed any type of threat to design jobs. And so the topic of data governance might seem very removed from all of that, but I would argue that it is actually the foundation of talks about generative AI and how to make it more transparent, more ethical, more secure. And so what we'll talk about today is data governance in the context of data mesh architecture, which if you are in the data space, you have probably heard about. You might have even worked with it, but you might not know what it is or how to gain value from it. And you might not know how governance fits into it. So that is what we will cover today. We'll start by talking about some of the biggest challenges I'm seeing with big data that I see with my clients and also read about in the broader tech world. We'll talk about data mesh, what it is, what it's not, and how it can be a solution to these dilemmas that we're talking about. I will give an introduction to data governance on its own, but also in the context of data mesh architecture. And finally, I will end by teaching you some design thinking techniques that you can apply to managing data at scale. I am a service designer at heart, and I do believe that data governance is not a technical problem to be solved. It's a design challenge to co-create with your team. And so I will talk to you about some tips to do that during this presentation. Before I do that, here's some information about me. As I mentioned, my name's Lauren Maffeo. I am a service designer at a company called Steampunk. We are a human-centered design firm building and designing digital products and services for federal government clients in the United States. I specialize in designing data and digital products that range from websites and databases to service models for chief data officers. I very recently advised an assistant chief data officer at a U.S. federal agency on his data strategy. As mentioned, I also wrote a book that is published through the Pragmatic Programmers called Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up, and you can get it at the link below. And I've been working in tech for over 10 years now, first as a reporter and then within the sector. And I've been contributing to open source communities for 5 years, mostly in Drupal, but I've also been a community correspondent for opensource.com, and I was an active participant in the Women Who Code DC chapter. So I always start this presentation by giving this cheeky intro slide from Jordan Tagani, which shows an upward curve that illustrates the fact that by X year, there will be Y amount of data generated. And this presumably is always shown as a good thing because we've been hearing for years now that data is the new oil. It's the most valuable asset that an organization can have. And so if you have a lot of data, that is automatically a good thing by default. It means that you have an edge over your competition. It means that you know more about your customers, and you are implicitly running a more effective business, whether you are a profit-driven organization or you are a nonprofit. But I think we're ultimately all here because we know that that is not the case. If you are a practitioner, if you work with data, if you're a data scientist, you know that there are a lot of challenges with this volume of data that are exponential across different themes. So these statistics you're looking at here come from a survey that was run about 2 years ago. They surveyed a range of senior leaders, and the results were pretty telling. They found from talking to these C-suite leaders that their data volumes grew by 63% per month on average. The mean number of data sources per organization was 400. So when you think about the amount of sources you are both ingesting data from and producing data on behalf of, that is a very high number. This survey also found that 99% of respondents planned to migrate to the cloud over 2 years. That's not surprising given the state of tech today. What was a little more surprising was the fact that 90% of respondents said that it was hard to prepare the data they had for analytics. And when you think about the whole reason that you have data in the first place, the reason that you consume it, clean it, put it into models, why are you doing all of that? You're presumably putting it into place so that different audiences, different users can consume the data that's most relevant for them, that they can have trust that it has been vetted, and that they can use it for their own benefit. So the fact that 9 out of 10 respondents to this survey said that this was difficult for them shows that this is a pretty big problem. And when we think about why this is a problem, I think it ultimately boils down to the fact that change is hard. These are the results from a separate survey that was covered by the Harvard Business Review within the last 2 years. And 1 in 4 respondents to this survey said that they were data-driven. Not only is that a low number, but the number of respondents in the prior year before this survey, in that survey, 38% of respondents said that they are data-driven. So if you think about it, the volume of data produced has grown exponentially, while the number of organizational leaders who say they're data-driven has gone down. So that also shows a big problem. These leaders surveyed consistently cited technical hardships as being less of an issue than cultural hardships. So the people were more of a barrier than the tech that they were using. And if you work in data, you've probably heard the statistic that approximately 13% of machine learning models make it to production. That means that there is a lot of time, money, and talent that is being wasted on machine learning models that never even make it to the light of day. So for every ChatGPT that we hear about, there are countless more models that we never hear about because they are just not built and produced and executed in a strategic fashion. And so that means that there is a lot of wasted resources, and it's resulting in a lot of very frustrated data scientists, many of whom I work with on a regular basis. And when I was looking for a quote to really capture this problem, this quote from a song came up, because the reality is that everybody wants to change the world, but very few people actually want to look in the mirror and change themselves. Very few people want to look at the way their organization operates and ask what they could do better or how they could improve. It's always easier to look outward. It's always easier to look at what others are doing wrong. But if you want to do the hard work of bringing your models to production and increasing data quality in your organization, you really do have to look at what is in your control. You cannot control how something like ChatGPT is trained, but you can control the integrity and the quality of your data in your organization. And the good news is that this is a solvable problem. I have found through several years of service and systems design for data-focused projects that something called federated data governance can help solve these problems, because it automates the standards that you need to decentralize your data. What do I mean by decentralizing your data? This is where we'll talk about data governance, data mesh, and how they work together to create a more decentralized, open data environment in your architecture. So I'll start by defining what data governance is. It is not a singular tool, role, or technique that you can use as a magic bullet. It's a holistic strategy to manage the people, processes, and tools related to how your organization stores its data and its associated metadata. So if you have a piece of data, that could be your name, and then pieces of metadata could be everything from your date of birth, your address, your social security number. This is data about data that helps you find the data you need, aka my name, faster and more effectively. And you need a strategy for how you are going to manage that data at scale. If you think about the number of sources that respondents to that survey we just saw said they said that the mean number is 400. Now think about every piece of data that is being ingested. That is a lot of data, and nobody can do that by hand. I don't care if you're the best data scientist in the world, if you're the most well-educated chief data officer, this job is too big for one person or one team to manage. And that's why governance comes in, because governance is how you set the standards which share how your organization collects, stores, processes, and destroys data. So you're managing data throughout the entire life cycle, from the time that you bring it in to the time that it is both used in models and deployed to production, and probably reused, because the reality is that several pieces of data are very often used in several different contexts, and you need an architecture to see how that piece of data is being used throughout your business for different purposes. And then ideally, data governance is scaled to improve your technical environment and your service delivery. So data governance should never be something that you are doing off in the corner, separate from your technical environment. If your governance standards are not driving your architecture and design decisions about your data environment, something has gone wrong. And I want to emphasize that because I often hear people say that data governance is too abstract. It's not able to be implemented effectively. And that does tell me that there's something going wrong there, because you should be automating those standards for governance within your architecture, whether you're using data mesh or another architectural pattern. And that brings us to data mesh, because this is a pretty new concept. It was introduced by Zhamak Dehghani when she was at ThoughtWorks in 2019, and it promotes a data as products mindset. You've probably heard about managing data as products. It's a relatively new way of thinking about data management in that world, but it's fundamentally different from how data has been managed in the past. Typically, we've seen data managed by a CIO office. That office has had control over access to data and different data sets. They've also had control over the data catalog. They might have written data definitions, even if they were not sure what those definitions were, or they didn't consult with the people in those respective groups. And so typically it's been more of a data as a service model, where there's a top-down approach to access to data. In contrast, data mesh promotes product and manages products according to respective data domains. I'll tell you about how to define your data domains later in this presentation, because that is a building block of data governance. But in the meantime, data mesh also keeps all of your data available within one self-service architecture environment. The idea here is that you are, rather than having your data in an on-premise server, a cloud server, in several servers, you're instead keep managing data according to their respective domains. You're classifying that data effectively, and you're keeping it all in the same environment, which allows everybody to access it in the same environment if they need to. It's like having a SharePoint site where everybody knows they can go to that SharePoint site to find the respective information that they need. Although ideally, data mesh is organized more effectively than SharePoint, which can become a black hole. With data mesh, you are ensuring that the data is in the same environment. You're also ensuring that data is formatted, stored, and discovered against equal standards, so that everybody knows not only where that data is, but who they can go to access particular data sets, and then they can use it and format it according to your data quality standards. And that's really what brings us to federated data governance. This is where you automate your governance standards throughout the architecture. This guides domain-specific data stewards through that process of building data products. And it defines parameters for how to build, define, access, and use data products in the data mesh. Now, I do have to mention some caveats here, because we are talking about a new architectural pattern. We're talking about a new way of thinking. When I give this presentation, I am often asked for examples of data mesh in practice, because I think many people are used to hearing about it now in writing, but people want to see how it's being used today. I do have a case study of how data mesh is being used today, which I will share later in the presentation. But I do have to acknowledge the fact that data mesh first came about in 2019. It's a young, evolving process, and nobody, including the founder of it, is a true expert in how it is executed. This is a new way of thinking that is being implemented and tested. So as with anything, it's evolving. And it's also not a singular tool, role, or standard. I think in the tech world, we're often very eager to not only find the latest framework or language that can solve every problem of ours, but we also tend to see things as a magic bullet. Data mesh is not that. This is not a cheap or easy way of managing your data, although it does have a lot of value, which I'll talk about. And ultimately, you can't do data mesh well without governance. Part of the reason I wrote the book that I did is because, having worked in the data space, first as an analyst at Gartner and now at Steampunk, both on the analyst side and on the practitioner side, data maturity in organizations still remains incredibly low, even as that volume of data has increased. And people still don't want to invest in data governance. That's broadly what I'm seeing. I see it with clients who hire us to do it and then don't want to implement it the way we suggest. I see it with CDOs who get very myopic on which machine learning framework they should use, but they haven't thought at all about data ownership or what data quality looks like. And so people are really kicking the can down the road, and that needs to stop if people are going to be managing data at scale, because again, the scope of work is just too big. And I do think that data mesh holds a lot of potential for this new wave of big data that we're in. So there are a couple of core tenets of data mesh that are really valuable. The first is domain driven design. This is where data domain owners, aka data stewards, get more autonomy to know and make decisions about the data in their purview. This means that if you have a VP of sales who manages the sales team and is responsible for the sales team's success, they should also have a hand in managing and making decisions about the sales data that your organization owns. And so it decentralizes not just your data, but it gives more autonomy to make decisions about data to more people in your organization. I always say this does not mean that your VP of sales is going to start building your ETL pipelines, but it does mean that they are going to start collaborating with your team to define data quality standards for the sales data. And those standards are what the data team, your scientists, your engineers automate within the data mesh environment. So it's fundamentally also a more cross-functional way of working, because you work across business and technical roles to define what data quality looks like per domain. It, along with providing autonomous data teams, data mesh architecture supports data domain data analysis. It allows people to discover data more easily. And it's decentralized microservice architecture that interconnects data, very similar to APIs in microservice architecture. So if you're looking for a one-to-one comparison to visualize data mesh more effectively, you can think about APIs in microservices to get a sense of what it could look like. And that brings us to federated governance. It really has 4 core tenets. The first is interoperability, I should say. This is where you define the parameters that allow your data stewards to leverage data products across the data mesh. There's also documentation. This is really crucial because it helps everyone in your org learn how to find and use the data products that you have. There's security, which sets role-based access by creating identity and access management policies within your cloud platform. It tells your data domain owners who should and shouldn't be accessing data sets. And finally, there's compliance. This is where you automate requirements for everything from legal rights to PII masking within your data mesh, so that you make sure you are in compliance with the range of data regulations that we're seeing today. And we are seeing more and more of those. And so this is a snapshot of what federated data governance can look like in action. You have your data standards, which are set by the data stewards who manage the data domains, and they're integrated into your engineering practices. You then have the enterprise data lake, and that's where you control everything from scanning and measurement to access, lineage, and validation. And at the end of it, you have a scalable data governance that is evidence-based and passes quality standards, so that by the time your users consume it, they can be assured that you have put a lot of thought and care into the data that they're consuming. I very often hear when I work with data users and consumers that they don't trust the data that is coming to them. And if you read the book that I wrote, I use the whole first chapter talks about writing a mission statement for how you use data and measuring your data success against a framework that Gartner uses. And one of the pillars of it is promoting trust and transparency. There is very low trust in the data that is out there today. And frankly, that's as it should be, because the reality is that most data today has not been vetted. It is not adhering to any quality standards, and that is driving an enormous amount of problems. Now, the flip side of this, we talked about the benefits of data mesh, which I do believe in, but the reality is that if you do not invest in building a data-driven culture, your data mesh efforts are going to fail, because you can't just build this new architecture and expect people to come to it understanding how it works. You can't expect just your data team to stand it up and have it be successful if you have not designed your data mesh architecture with and for consumers, aka your colleagues. You're not going to succeed in the long term. And so in order to reap the rewards of data mesh that we talked about, you need to create governance with your cross-functional teams in a collaborative way. And that's why I named this book Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up. As a service designer, I fundamentally believe that data governance is a design challenge to be solved, and that it is solvable. That's a really important thing to emphasize, because so often, especially the media narrative today, focuses on the fact that AI is, I see constant headlines about how AI is going to risk basically wiping humans off the face of the earth if they become uncontrollable. And that type of narrative is absolving people of the responsibility and the autonomy that we still have over these solutions, because at the end of the day, when we talk about AI, we're talking about data. And so if we invest in the quality standards and the governance required to manage this data at scale, a lot of these challenges can at least be addressed, if not solved. And so in order to solve that question yourself, you need to start by answering two questions. The first is, what is my company's mission statement, and how does our use of data fulfill that mission? And when I ask people these two questions, sometimes the first question sparks some indignation, because people think, I know what my company does. I know what I do in my company. Why do I need to bother answering this question? And you need to bother answering this question because I speak to quite a few very senior leaders at the C-suite level about their organization. And when I ask why they hired us, they will often talk about a compliance requirement that they have to meet. They will talk about how their on-premise server is going to end of life in 1.5 years, and they have to migrate over to the cloud. They'll talk about the latest machine learning framework that they want to use, but they don't articulate why their organization exists in the first place. That means that they can't articulate the value that their organization is bringing. They can't evaluate who they are serving. And if they can't answer those very basic questions, they probably can't answer where their data lives, which server it's on, which format it's in, whether it needs to be converted to a new format before data scientists can put it into a model. And those are all very important questions to be answered. And I can also tell you, as someone who's gone in and tried to work with data architects to design new systems and interfaces, very often our clients can't answer these questions. It sends us on a months-long discovery chase where we try to find that data and where it lives, and we're wasting weeks, if not months, of work that we could have used. If our clients had that information, we could have just gone to work to figure out a solution for them. And so if you can't answer these two questions, that is the place to start when you think about data governance in the context of data mesh. The other thing that you want to do once you've answered those questions is start by defining data domains. When we talk about data domains, we're talking about the core areas of your organization that you both ingest and produce data on. And so if you're not sure which data domains you have, you can start by answering a few key questions. You want to start by asking what your organization's key areas of interest are. You want to address which problem spaces your organization is in. You want to look at the structure of your org. How is it architected? Who reports to whom? And on that note, you want to end by asking who leads each problem space and the data associated with it. This last question is really important because it leads into the next part of this work, where you are going to identify your core data domains and the subdomains underneath them. So this is a hypothetical map that this is a business process map that is taken from a blog post at Towards Data Science. The author chose a hypothetical airline, and they have chosen to visualize 4 data domains here with subdomains underneath each one. And the specifics are less important than looking at how this is structured. So this is what a business process map would look like if you are trying to define what your own data domains are and how to classify that data underneath. Now, different data points will fall under 2 different categories at times. And so this is where data governance can get a little messy, because if you have several data points that are being used across domains, ultimately the question becomes who owns it? And that is not an easy question to answer, but I do think it comes back to the function of that data. So for instance, if you have a data point on ground crew personnel management, that is going to be used maybe across several domains, but ultimately it would be under the staff and personnel management domain, and whoever owns that is the person responsible for it. That's a simplified way of going about it, but if you want an easy way to go about doing this work, you can start there, because then the domain owner is going to have that autonomy to define who owns which respective piece of data and how that data is used across domains. And again, these are not easy or simple solutions, but just having an owner of this data, having it categorized, having it tagged the right way, those are activities which are not commonplace today, even though they might seem obvious to this group. So if you start by doing that, that's a really important step. And on that note of ownership, you really want to be thinking about who can be your data specific or domain specific data stewards. So these are people in your organization who are the most senior leaders of these various domains you've identified. These are the people who have a vested interest in making sure that the data their domains produce is correct, that it's accurate. Their job success probably hinges on that data being correct and accurate. And so these are the people that you really want to bring into this data governance work. I often see job requirements and job specs for data governance leads or data governance managers. I don't think that's necessarily in itself a bad approach if that organization has enough resources. Having said that, one of the big benefits of data stewards is that they are already in your organization. They are already familiar with your company's cultural nuances. They know how things work and they know their areas. And that is the knowledge that they bring to data stewardship. So here we have these 4 hypothetical data stewards that manage and own domains across several verticals: customer, product and service data, sales and transactional data, and legal data. So these are the people who are leading these data domains, and they are the people who are best positioned to make decisions and advise on the data quality and what that looks like for their respective domains. And that brings us to defining data quality. There are many ways to do it, and it is much less simple than this little table would suggest. But again, we all need a starting point. And no matter which data domains you have, you are going to have to define these 4 variables. You are going to have to define, and your data stewards are going to have to define the component names of each data point, the goal, in other words, what are these data points being used for? Why are you collecting it? Which domain does it fall under? And then you want to define the success conditions and the failed conditions. I gave this talk at Open Source North in St. Paul, Minnesota last week, and I spoke to a software tester at the end of it. And she said that this presentation and the principles within it would be really valuable to her, because as a tester, she needs to know what success looks like for data and what failure looks like. And so that is something that, as the experts in data, I'm guessing we have a lot of engineers, scientists, and architects on this talk, you're going to help define what that looks like. But the idea is that you should be working with the leaders of those data domains to ensure that you're on the same page and that you are working collaboratively, because you need to know what success and failure looks like when you're in the tech environment, but they also need to know and define what success and failure looks like. And so I promised earlier that you would get a peek at what data mesh looks like in practice. And this is an example of what data mesh looks like at JP Morgan. This is taken from the AWS blog, and it shows how they have chosen to organize their data mesh environment. So you have your business process, which we talked about. You have operational systems to manage that process. And then you can see that the data goes into product-specific data lakes. So in this case, each domain, there are 3 here, has its own lake with its own data and its own catalog. And then all of that feeds into the same mesh catalog. So the mesh catalog is where you have the data being pulled in real time from all of these 3 respective domains. It is updated in real time, which means you can be assured that you are always getting the latest data. And then you have your consuming apps, which are hooked up to the mesh catalog, and then the users receive that data on the front end of these consuming apps. And in the AWS environment, they're using tools like Athena. They're using various tools in the AWS sphere to both make data more searchable, to privatize it, to do all of that stuff. Here's another view of what this can look like at JP Morgan. So you have in this view your business process and your operational system, but you also have the product owner. You have that data steward who is describing and classifying the business data. That information is going into the enterprise data catalog, which hooks up to the mesh catalog. It also hooks up to the data domain. And all of this is happening in the same data mesh environment. So we are talking, again, less about the intricacies of AWS and more about this concept that you are managing your data in very strategic ways, that each data domain has its own data lake, and ultimately it all hooks up to the same mesh catalog. And then the consuming apps hook up to the catalog, and that is how your people consume it on the front end. And so it is while it might look complicated, it is a more simple way of managing your data because it puts everything in the same environment. So everybody knows where to go for it. They know who is the domain owners, which means that they know who to request it from. They know they should be able to look into the catalog and see which domain each data point is structured in, and then they can get it in a more strategic way. They can find it more easily, and they can use it to their benefit. So in summary, when we do data mesh well, it allows teams to access, develop, and manage their data in a more autonomous way in both business and technical roles. It gives your data stewardship team an easier way to keep your data secure and of sound quality, and you're solving a major problem and going ahead of your competition when you manage it this way. But there is a catch. Data mesh only works if you've done that hard work to create a data-driven culture and to automate that culture's standards. So I hope that this presentation gave some food for thought about how to do that and how to manage your big data at scale. If you're a chief data officer, I hope it gave you some food for thought about how you can spread that responsibility for data across the organization. And if you would like to connect and speak about this further, I would love to connect with you. I am on LinkedIn under my name. I would also love if you would purchase a copy of this book. You can buy it directly from the publisher via the link here. And they mentioned at the beginning that I worked out a deal with my publisher for folks who attended this talk. So if you use the promo code Maffeo Spring, all one word, all caps, you should be able to enter that for 30% off of your copy. And they are also running a spring sale on various titles as well for 50% off. So if you go to this website and want to buy a copy of the book, I would love to have you do that at a discount. I will say that the book is much more focused on the intricacies of building a data governance program and taking the steps you need to build a data-driven culture. Data mesh does get a mention in chapter 6, but it is not the focus of the book. So I just want to be clear about that it is not a deep dive on data mesh in particular, but if you're looking for a resource that can help you manage your data more effectively and get everyone involved so that it is not all of your responsibility, I would love to have you purchase it and to hear what you think.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. That was a great overview. Enjoyed it and thought it was relevant to what I've experienced with data governance and data mesh thus far. It is very new, and that's what makes it so interesting. So just to answer one or two questions, Alvin put the URL to the ebook for Lauren's book in the chat, so feel free to check that out. I'll also be following up probably in the next 24 hours with an email with that information in it as well. So feel free to copy and paste that for the time being, or take a screenshot of that URL in the chat. Lauren, can you repeat the discount code for the book?
Yep, so I just put it in the chat, and it is Maffeo Spring at checkout, and you should be able to use that and get 30% off.
Okay, that is great. And then moving on here, question from Richard in the Q&A. How can you best manage the automated use of unreliable data, particularly when the identification of that bad data is difficult and impossible? Also, is the mesh catalog just another term for data warehouse?
Yeah, that's those are good questions. So this is the biggest challenge that I encounter working with folks doing this work is it's less about how do we prepare for the future, and it's more about how do we even begin to go about assessing the data that we have today, because you probably have many data points in your possession, and then the question becomes, how do I retroactively go back and solve that technical debt? And that is not an easy way to go about it, but I do think that you can begin by answering those basic questions about where does my data live? Who, if anybody, owns it? The answer very well might be no one. If you're like many organizations that I work with, the answer is no one, and that is valuable information to know. And then you want to look at the format that it's in, and does it meet its intended purpose? And again, doing this at scale is very difficult, and I want to acknowledge that. But I think the first thing that you really have to do is look at where you're at. If you read the book, chapter 4 is all about writing a roadmap for implementing a data-focused project in your organization. And it really begins by taking an honest look at the state of data in your organization today. It starts by doing a data maturity assessment, which might not be fun for every organization because nobody likes to see where they're falling short, but it is really important information because it shows your data stewardship team where you need to refocus your efforts and where you can prioritize the data that is the most valuable. And so that is a really important place to start. When we think about the mesh catalog, I would say that it really is looking at tools like Informatica and Calibra and how they fit into your current infrastructure. This is also not an easy problem to solve because it's one thing if you are starting a new startup, you're going to be collecting a lot of data and you want to implement Azure or AWS. If you're starting from scratch, you might not have as much data as other organizations and you might feel like you're at a disadvantage, but actually in my experience, that's a really exciting opportunity to begin with data governance where many people have to do that retroactive work that's really painful. And so I think about the mesh catalog as really being that centralized place where all of your data domains intersect. That's where all the data goes, and then it hooks up to those consuming apps. So I would not classify that as a warehouse, although if you're thinking about it in that term of this is the centralized place where all of the data lives, that would be accurate. The one difference I would say is that your mesh catalog should support all types of data, whether structured, unstructured, or semi-structured, and data warehousing has limitations there. It also has limitations for how much data it can consume. And so mesh is not exponential in terms of its support, but the idea behind it is that it does support not only many types of data, but also higher volumes of data. And that's another problem that we've seen with data warehouses is that they do not support the volume of data that exists today. So this is one way of solving that in a new architecture environment.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going back to Jacob's question in the chat, not in the Q&A. How do you sync these independent domain owners to make sure they don't develop conflicting or silos in data governance? Do you create an oversight group?
Yes, you do. So that is also a great question because chapter 3 of the book talks about building a data governance council. And I'm aware as I say that it sounds like just another meeting. It sounds like maybe a death by committee exercise. Implemented incorrectly, it definitely can be. And that is my biggest concern about sharing this advice, is that I think it's really valuable, but I also see the ways that it could get misused or taken out of context. I think we've all worked in agile environments that were not actually agile, or they were applying agile to a project that was not meant to be agile. And we know how painful that is. And I think something similar could happen with data governance. Having said that, you do need a very structured way of these business and technical data domain owners to speak with each other on a regular basis. There's no substitute for that, because if you keep people in silos, you're not actually solving the problem. You're just making it worse, actually, because then you're giving people more autonomy without having them talk to each other, without having them collaborate, without having them come to consensus. And that's no good at all. It's certainly not going to improve your architecture environment. So chapter 3 of the book does get into building a data governance council, figuring out what to prioritize for your first project, figuring out how to write a charter and what you should work on first for your project. It talks about finding an executive sponsor, because I really do believe that data governance has to be a top-down effort. It requires time, money, resources, and you can be the most senior data leader in your organization, but if you do not have the support of the C-suite, you're only going to get so far. So sponsorship of the council is very important. And the book talks about that in more detail. But yes, you absolutely do need a cohesive way of bringing all of these people together. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to make this work. I also think there's a lot of opportunity to look at ways of gamifying your culture to make it more data-driven. And I see a lot of parallels between what the security world is doing and what we could be doing with data. For instance, we know that the biggest source of breaches in an organization is a company's own employees. An employee is the most likely person to inadvertently expose data and expose a company to risk. And so as a result, we're seeing more organizations do more phishing tests to measure the health of their cybersecurity structure, to sending out phishing tests to their employees to see who clicks on links. And then if that person clicks on a nefarious link, then they have to take a mini training that takes 2 to 3 minutes. And then they measure the success of that over time. I think there's a lot of opportunity to redefine what that looks like. And so if you are in charge of big data and data strategy at your organization, you can start taking those small steps to build a data-driven culture and build a data governance council that is truly cross-functional. It's not simple work. It takes time. It does take consensus, but there is also precedent for it. If you've ever served on a board of directors, as I do, you know that there are charters, there are bylaws, there are votes. I mean, and these are the mechanisms by which entire organizations run, both public and private, nonprofit, for-profit. You can do very similar things with your data stewardship committee. And so you are not in the wilderness completely on your own. This might be a new concept. This might be new to implement because not many people are doing it, but it is possible, and you do have more resources than you think.
Thank you. Moving on, let's say you're working with a data delivery team that is completely into implementing data mesh, but has had 0 conversations with a user-based data scientist about data mesh. How would you connect those dots?
I have a bias here as a service designer, because my job on technical teams is to be the user advocate and to be speaking with clients and stakeholders about what I'm hearing from their users about their experience using a particular product or service. So my answer here is that you're going to want to go through a discovery period where you have someone, whether it's a data scientist or a designer themselves, maybe someone in a research role, figure out who the core users of your data mesh are, speak to them about their experience managing data today, capture those results. You would want to capture them in a tool like a journey map, which shows the particular steps that people take to use a product or service. It shows where they encounter friction in their experience using that product or service. And ultimately, it proposes solutions for how you might improve their use of that product or service. So the first question I would say is, who are your users and how can you talk to them? And if you're implementing data mesh, the reality is that your users are very likely your colleagues. These are the people who are going to be going into the data mesh, requesting access to different domains, managing domains themselves. And even if they're not doing that today, they very likely are managing data in some form today. It's probably not the best experience. And so capturing that information gives you a really important starting point, because once you know the state of data use and access today, you can design a more effective path forward.
Great, thank you. That was a good one as well. There's a lot of good questions. This one coming from Mark in the chat, based on your mention of gamification, can you generate lasting interest with individuals in the corporation if you turn knowledge of the corporate data into a form of GeoGuessr?
I'm not totally sure what GeoGuessr is, but I think anything that you can do to promote education about data in an organization is going to be really valuable. So for instance, if you are working in a company and you have those quality standards for what inbound sales lead data looks like, sharing that across not only your sales team, but across the organization in particular ways can be really valuable, because it shows people that not all data is the same. Not all data is alike. You shouldn't be using all data, depending on how it is surfaced, depending on how it was collected, depending on whether it has been vetted by your data scientists. And so anything that you can do to really start building those foundations for data literacy are really important. We talk a lot in society today about the lack of media literacy, because there are so many new sources of media that just did not exist when our parents, for instance, were in college. And the same is true with data times 10. I mean, there is so much data being produced today from so many different sources. We have so many interconnected devices, and we have virtually no mechanisms today at scale for how to assess and scan that data against predefined quality standards. And when we talk about quality standards too, we're talking about, is data vetted and fit for consumption and fit for its intended use? That is going to look different depending on context, depending on who's deploying it, which organization it exists on behalf of. There's not a uniform answer for that, but you still have to define what success looks like in your organization and what quality looks like for the data in your organization, because that's going to be a different answer depending on where you work. But figuring it out and taking those steps to define it is really crucial.
No, good call. Gamification's been around for a while, so it's cool to incorporate a data element to it. I've been in some organizations where we've implemented gamification options. This one comes from Alvin. In one of your slides, you mentioned about Red Lake, Yellow Lake, and Blue Lake. What exactly are those, and what differentiates between them?
So in that context, we were talking about data mesh at JP Morgan, and it was an illustration of those particular colors were each representing a new data domain. And so if we think about the examples we discussed earlier, we had customer data, product data, and legal data as 3 examples. And so you could very easily apply those 3 data domains to what we saw in the data mesh. The idea there is that you have those separate domains. They are managed by owners as particular data domains with their own catalogs, but they're all in that same architecture environment, and they all hook up to the same mesh catalog. So it's less about what are the particular domains, and it's more about organizing them in a more structured way, a more effective way, and then giving it a mechanism to ultimately connect to one singular catalog where anybody can look up information about that data, because that is how users consume it more effectively. And it's also how other data owners, aka your colleagues, find that data faster.
Okay, thank you. I think I've covered all of the questions, going once, going twice, if anybody else wants to add. Again, thank you, Lauren. Your LinkedIn profile is in the slide, and I know you put it in the chat, so feel free to connect with Lauren. We also use this for virtual networking, especially during the pandemic. So I know I've relied on LinkedIn quite a bit to do that over the last few years. And then I know, Alvin, I mentioned earlier, there's a continuing education credit certificate that you issue. I don't know if you want to share that at this point.
Yeah, sure. So for those people, who want to get a professional development hour to kind of credit for your, professional engineer certification or so, you can claim that. So what we'll do is that, we'll have a certificate there, and you can add your name to that. So we'll put that, I guess, in the email that Terry will send out to all the attendees, and then you can use that to claim your PDH for your continuing education. Yeah.
We usually have a survey. It helps us with feedback, so we improve our meetings. We've had various meetings in the last few months, including getting some media coverage, which is great for the ACM and what we do here. So getting survey information always good to see how we can improve, what people like, what people don't like. Lauren worked with us pretty fast on this one. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for coming. Feel free to check out ACM DC and ACM Chicago. We both have meetup groups. If you aren't a part of that, please join. That's how we get these out. We both also have emailing groups that we use as well. But feel free to stay in touch, and hopefully now that the pandemic's over, at least the DC group will hopefully have more of a cadence. Alvin and Mark have been doing a great job having a monthly cadence during the pandemic. So look forward to continued collaboration with these two guys, and Greg, thank you as well. I know you popped on here. So yeah, I think that's all I have. Any other last words before we close it down?
I just want to thank you all for coming, and thank you three for organizing this. As Terry said, we put this together pretty quickly, which was great for me, and really I'm very grateful for that. I am working full-time and a first-time author doing the promo currently by myself, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you all, and that wouldn't have happened without the organizers. So thank you for hosting this, and thank you for managing the groups, because it is not easy work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lauren. Yeah, and also to add to that too as well, since we record these talks, so what we try to do is that, we have these talks on our YouTube ACM Chicago channel, so you can subscribe to that. You can find the link to that if you go to I posted in the chat, if you go to the chicagoacm.org site, you should be able to find the link to our YouTube channel, as well as the other social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So you can find out our next events, and also YouTube can find out our, previous videos if you missed. So.
Yeah, the YouTube channel you guys have going is great. It's just me right now, and Alvin's, I think, governing almost all the sections. So I haven't been very proactive in doing video editing, and almost relying on you guys to do that at this point. With my combined volunteer efforts, I don't know if I have the bandwidth to do that. So continue to check out the YouTube channel of past Chicago, and we've had a few combined DC and Chicago events as well. So that's also on YouTube. And I'm also new to the DC area as well, so I have not been putting on as many meetings as the Chicago group, but maybe if I get another volunteer, we can start our own YouTube channel.
Yeah, and also too as well, we are a volunteer-based organization, so we really are governed by our volunteers. So we're always looking for more volunteers, ACM DC as well as ACM Chicago. So this is a great way to, give something back to the community and show your expertise. And, I really enjoy doing that. So, and it helps with your career too as well. So if you're really interested and want to get involved, no matter what, experience that you have or, what level, just get in contact, with myself. So I'll put my my email address, so chair@chicagoacm.org. Or you can also contact Terry for the ACM DC.
Okay, until next time, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Terry.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
night.
Mark.
Yep,
Thank
have a
you,
good night.
Greg. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, everyone. Have a good night.